Welcome back, everyone. And this is the walkthrough of Act II of William Shakespeare's Hamlet. So we're going to start with Act II, Scene 1. And this is back in Polonius's house. And Polonius is talking to a servant of his called Reynaldo. And he advises Reynaldo to seek out some of the fellow Danish students in Paris that are attending university. And he basically wants him to keep tabs on Laertes' behavior. And here's his little plan for that. His plan is that Reynaldo should get to be acquainted with the fellow Danes, and he should start bringing up little kind of stories or fake stories, just basically hinting at, oh yeah, Laertes, he's a wild dude. Isn't he into dueling? Or, I wonder how much Laertes owes in debts from all the cards he's playing. Kind of a gambling streak in him, isn't he? And the whole purpose of this kind of indirect bringing up of Laertes and flaws is so that if the Danes reply, oh my goodness, yes, you should have heard about that duel with so-and-so, blah, 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 blah. Or I have heard that he had to, hawk his best suit in order to pay off his debt to so-and-so. Or, well, of course, he cheats at cards. Or he's fallen in love with a prostitute at a brothel. His idea is that if Reynaldo brings up these kind of little conversation starters, then if anything is true, people will bring it up. So that's his way of keeping tabs on his son. Of course, Polonius can never do anything directly. He can never write to his son and say, so how are you using your money and what are you doing with your spare time? And I really hope you're not getting into debt or duels. And he can't even just simply send Reynaldo and say, basically just kind of shadow the guy. Or even say, hey, Reynaldo is going to be your new manservant now, and he will, basically know about your comings and goings and where your money's going. Instead, it has to be this very subtle, oh yeah, Laertes, he's kind of a wild man, isn't he? And then waiting to hear if actual stories come up. And so Reynaldo says, okay, he's going to do it, and he heads out. Ophelia then enters the scene, and she tells Polonius that Hamlet has been acting really strange lately, and that she was sewing one day in her kind of little room, and Hamlet came out and he was poorly dressed and everything was kind of chaotic, and he just looks at her and he sighs really deeply and intently. And Polonius gets excited because he says, oh, that's a sign that he actually really loves you. He's acting mad because of his love for you. And you followed my previous advice, right, about keeping him at a distance. And Ophelia replies that yes, she had been returning his letters without reply. She had been turning back his gifts, making sure she had very brief, very superficial conversations. And so Polonius says, and that is what's driving him mad. So he must really genuinely love you instead of just kind of treating you like a little flirtation and a plaything. And Polonius can't wait to share the news with Claudius, who is, of course, Hamlet's uncle. So that takes us to the second scene, which is with the king and Gertrude and these two minor characters called Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. And the king is welcoming Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. We find out that they were childhood companions of Hamlet. So they were fellow schoolmates and friends, basically people hanging out at the court who were the same age as Hamlet, involved in the same education and same activities. And he has called them there because he wants them to renew their friendship with Hamlet and to get close enough in order to figure out why Hamlet's behavior has changed so drastically and why he is acting so strangely. And they have agreed to do that for him. So then Polonius enters the scene and he says to the king and the queen, well, wait a minute, no, I'm going ahead. So he enters the scene And we have, again, another minor figure called Voltimand, who is apparently connected with the ambassadorship of Denmark in Norway. And Voltimand is returned to give some information. Apparently, young Fortinbras has been putting together an army that he claims he's going to use to march into Poland. Except Voltimand found out that Poland is just a ruse, that what Fortinbras is actually planning to do with the army is to bring it into Denmark and to reclaim the lands that Fortinbras Sr. lost in the duel with Hamlet Sr. Except the King of Norway, who is Fortinbras' uncle, finds out about the plan and says, no, do not do that. Leave Denmark alone. So Fortinbras agrees that he's like, okay, yeah, I really am going to invade Poland and I will stay away from Denmark. But he does have a request. And this is about line 70, like around 77. That it might please you to give quiet pass through your dominions for this enterprise, on such regards of safety and allowance as therein are set down. So basically, the King of Norway is asking the favor of, could you let my nephew and his army cross through Denmark safely without any harassment or any attacks in order to get to Poland and attack them? And King Claudius is like, okay, fine, we'll do that. Then Polonius comes forward and says, well, I just found out that one reason Hamlet might be acting so strangely is because he genuinely is in love with my daughter, Ophelia. And when I had told her to act more restrained and to kind of keep her distance from him, that must have upset him so much. That is why he's acting the way he is. And the queen is pretty excited about that. And Polonius shows a letter that Ophelia received from Hamlet, and it's kind of full of this kind of over-the-top, courtly love language. And Polonius is kind of commenting upon it, and the queen and king are like, yeah, shut up. Can you just get to the main point? And Polonius, as he generally tends to do, has to belabor a point, like me. But this definitely intrigues these parents, thinking, well, there might be some value to marrying Hamlet to one of our subjects rather than to arranging a marriage that would be with a foreign country, an alliance. So Hamlet enters, and the king and queen withdraw to hide. And so they're spying on the conversation that Hamlet and Polonius have. And Polonius is like, yeah, you kind of know I have a daughter, right? And Hamlet's like, oh yeah, I kind of know who you are. You're a fishmonger. And the fishmonger was not only a person who sold fish, but also was a slang term for a procurer, basically a pimp. And Polonius is like, oh, come on, you know who I am. I'm Polonius. I'm a counselor here, and you know I have a daughter. And then Hamlet responds with some more kind of insults veiled as nonsense. And he even insinuates that Polonius is like the Old Testament figure Jephthah. And he says, Jephthah had a daughter that he dearly loved. Well, in the particular story about Jephthah and his daughter, he ends up sacrificing his daughter, literally killing her and offering her as a sacrifice to God in order to, get pardon or forgiveness. And so Hamlet is basically saying, you're like the guy who's willing to sacrifice or to give up your daughter's life and happiness for some kind of favor. And Polonius is not getting these. Then Rosencrantz and Guildenstern come out. They reacquaint themselves with Hamlet, and they talk about how he's doing. And then we have one of them mentioning that there are a troop of players they saw on their way to Elsinore Castle. This gets Hamlet very interested. And he wants to know, so are these players coming to perform at the castle? And they say yes. Now you notice something interesting. Most of Hamlet, like almost all Shakespeare's tragedies, is written in blank verse. Basically, it's verse that has like a rhythmic pattern to it, but it doesn't necessarily rhyme, except for those little rhymed couplets I mentioned, usually at the end of scenes. But as Hamlet and Guildenstern and Rosencrantz are discussing the players, they switch to prose. And you can see that just the appearance is very different. It looks like a page from a short story. It does not look like a page of poetry that doesn't rhyme. But Hamlet does say a rather famous passage around line 287 to 292. What a piece of work is man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculty, in form and moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. And yet to me, what is this quintessence of dust? Man delights not me, no, nor woman I'm either, though by your smiling you seem to say so. So he's kind of letting Rosencrantz and Guildenstern believe that part of his madness is that while he can say man is kind of the apex of creation, he's godlike in apprehension and in knowledge. He's beautiful, the form of an angel, since humanity was supposed to be created in God's image. He says, but at the same time, I'm just done with them. I'm not interested in men. I'm not interested in women. I can acknowledge what people say about men, but I don't believe it. And so that is why the idea of players coming to stage a play seems like a good one. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern say, we know that you've enjoyed plays in the past. Maybe watching a performance by these actors will make you feel better, maybe get you to stop acting less insane. And Hamlet then asks, so is the same troupe that is entertained here in the past? Apparently it is. And Hamlet also wants to know, what about the acting troupe of boys, of children that have been performing recently in the capital? And how has that affected this troupe of adults and teenagers and their success? And we learn that the children's company has been very popular and that they perform in a set theater that is basically indoors and attended by the well-to-do and the aristocracy because it's more expensive than the regular open-air theater. And the reason why Shakespeare spends time on this is that he's making fun of something that actually happened in the early 17th century. The creation of this acting troupe of basically boys, both preteen and teenage boys, performing these plays, again, in a private theater that was indoors and that was attended generally by well-to-do people. And again, it was because it was more expensive. And it was seen kind of like a novelty, the idea that you have maybe a 10-year-old doing this great heroic speech, or this 8-year-old boy dressed up as a girl being courted by a 10-year-old boy dressed up as an adult man. And Shakespeare's troops, the King's Men, not only would be called to court to perform for King James in the court, but they still had the big round globe theater, the open air theater, that was available to anybody who could basically pay the money. And it was kind of set up on a class system. The cheapest seats were basically standing around the open stage. And then you had the circular building with boxes there where people could sit on benches. And then kind of the quote unquote private boxes that were usually closest to the stage, and they were the most expensive. So Shakespeare is kind of getting some digs in at these private, expensive boys actor companies versus what he grew up with and what he saw as kind of the real serious, authentic, lasting way of performance. Then we have the arrival of the players, and we have Hamlet complimenting them, and he greets the person who played the predominant leading lady parts. But he teases him about being taller than a chopin, which is like a platform shoe worn by women in the 16th and 17th centuries. Like, oh, I see you've grown taller by a chopin. And also, pray God, your voice, like a piece of uncurrent gold, be not cracked with the ring. So he's kind of joking with this guy and saying, yeah, you know, you've grown taller since I've seen you, and I just hope that your voice hasn't changed. So he's basically talking to a teenage boy, you know, on the verge of shifting into adulthood. And that was true, because the parts of women were played usually by young adolescent boys in Shakespeare's time. The idea of a woman acting on the stage was just considered immoral and unacceptable. He also talks to the head player and says, you know, I want, you know, there's this one particular speech that he really likes, and it's basically from a stage adaptation of the Aeneid. And if you remember, in the Aeneid, Dido asks Aeneas to tell the story of the fall of Troy and how he survived and how he basically got washed up onto the shores of Libya and entered Carthage. So this is the speech that the player remembers, where Aeneas is describing how Pyrrhus, one of the Greek generals who led the attack from the Trojan horse's belly, how he emerges from the body of the Trojan horse, and how at first, you know, he's got soot all over him from the lanterns. But then, as he's killing his way through the streets of Troy, he starts getting dyed in the blood of Trojan children, women, adults, until finally he comes to the palace where Priam lives. And he has the description of how Priam puts on his last stand, and how, you know, it's both pathetic but kind of inspiring that this old man is willing to fight to the death when it comes to this young Greek warrior who's vicious and in his prime and better armed. And then he describes how Hecuba, the wife of Priam, when she sees her husband dead and basically his body being mutilated, she tries to wrap herself basically in a towel and tries to get the body away and try to protect it from being further degraded. And Hamlet says, this is great. Can you put on a play tonight? And the player says, why, of course we would. And so Hamlet takes him aside and says, could you do the play, The Murder of Gonzago? And the player says, yeah, we could. He said, so you could have it ready for this evening? Yes, we could. Would you mind inserting this little short speech I've written? It's about 16 lines long. Do you think you could learn it in time and put it in this part of the play? Yes, the player says he can do that. So we have, from the title alone, The Murder of Gonzago, an idea that this might be one of the revenge tragedies that had been so popular in the late 1580s and 1590s. So we're going to learn a little bit about this play. Then we have Hamlet left alone by the players and Rosencrantz and Guildenstern and Polonius. And he then makes one of his famous soliloquies, basically speaking out loud to himself. So again, starting around line 501. Oh, what a rogue and peasant slave am I! Is it not monstrous that this player here, but in a fiction, in a dream of passion, could force his soul so to his own conceit, that from her working all his visage wand? Tears in his eyes, distraction in his aspect, a broken voice, and with his whole function suiting with forms to his conceit, and all for nothing, for Hecuba. What's Hecuba to him, or he to Hecuba, that he should weep for her? So he's reflecting on what he's just seen, that this actor performing this speech about the death of Priam and the despair and the anxiety of Hecuba, seeing her husband die before her eyes. He's like, here's this guy who, just based on a piece of fiction, starts tearing up. You can see him being moved emotionally by the speech. And he's like, and what's Hecuba to him? She's an imaginary character. nobody that this player knows or, is even a real person, might just be a legendary character. And yet this man can get himself so worked up, with grief for and sympathy for this imaginary woman. And Hamlet contrasts that with the fact that if the player were in Hamlet's situation, that he had actually lost his father, that he actually had lost respect for his mother, that he actually had his uncle probably murder his father. He's like, if he were in the same situation that I was in, imagine the emotions that he would show then. Imagine the anger, the grief, the desire for revenge that he would feel. And then Hamlet contrasts himself. And this starts on around line 519. Yet I, a dull and muddy-mettled rascal, peak, like John a Dreams, unpregnant of my cause, and can say nothing. No, not for a king upon whose property and most dear life a damned defeat was made. Am I a coward? Who calls me villain? And he goes on about, basically who kind of mocks and teases him as a villain. Because Hamlet realizes, I'm not able to say anything or to do anything that even compares to the emotional power of this actor. And finally, I'm going to just kind of skip down to line, it looks like, my eyes are not good, 535. I would say 537. Why, what an ass am I! This is most brave, that I, the son of a dear father murdered, prompted to my revenge by heaven and hell, must, like a whore, unpack my heart with words and fall a-cursing like a very drab. So he says, I can't act, and so I have to kind of profess my love to my murdered father by words, by kind of, coming up with all these clever puns and double entendres and little disguised jabs in the guise of, oh, I'm going mad. He's like, instead of action. And a little further down, he starts to get this idea in his head. He starts to come up with a plan besides having the murder of Gonzago staged. And this is around line 545. I have heard that guilty creatures sitting at a play have by the very cunning of the scene been struck so to the soul that presently they have proclaimed their malefactions. For murder, though it have no tongue, will speak with most miraculous organ. I'll have these players play something like the murder of my father before mine uncle. I'll observe his looks. I'll tend him to the quick, if he but blench. I know my course. The spirit that I have seen may be the devil, and the devil hath power to assume a pleasing shape, yea, and perhaps out of my weakness and my melancholy, as he is very potent with such spirits, abuses me to damn me. I'll have grounds more relative than this. The play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king. So that is the conclusion of Act 2. And in that, Hamlet's plan is not only to figure out whether Claudius is actually guilty by watching his reaction to a similar murder in the play, but also to figure out if the ghost he spoke to was actually his father's ghost or was some kind of disguise put on by the devil to tempt Hamlet into murdering someone who may be innocent. So the play has a lot at stake. If Claudius shows some kind of a guilty conscience during the performance of a murder, then Hamlet can be like, all right, that really was my father's ghost. Claudius is really guilty. I can go full steam ahead on killing him to avenge my father's death. On the other hand, if the spirit was evil, a malignant one, that was trying to cause Hamlet to murder someone who may be innocent, it's the play that's going to show whether Claudius is innocent or guilty, and therefore whether Hamlet has the right to revenge his father, and that he was not just being manipulated by some evil spirit who's disguising itself as his father. So you can see how Hamlet is paranoid. And also you can see part of where his indecision comes from. He doesn't just blindly assume, of course, that is my father's ghost. And of course, I will, take his word that Claudius is guilty. All that hesitation is about, I want to do the right thing. And I want to make sure that I'm 100% right so that I am fulfilling my father's wish and not being the pawn of some other spirit at work. And that is why he kind of beats himself up in the earlier part of the soliloquy. Because he's like, why can't I just act? Why? Because he's got scruples. Why can't I feel the same way about my real father's death and act on that while this actor is able to show real emotion by talking about an imaginary figure from a play? So Act Two is basically kind of taken what was set up in Act One and kind of expanded on it a little. It has the introduction of minor characters who will play an important role, like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. It shows what Polonius does with the news that Hamlet has been acting in a way that makes him think, ooh, he might really love my daughter. It also shows how there is another parallel to the Fortinbras plot. Fortinbras Jr. was ready to sneak into Denmark under the guise of marching to Poland and take the land that he believed was his. And it was only his uncle that stopped him from it and made him pledge he would leave Denmark alone as he just peacefully marched through to Poland. Whereas, so we can see that Fortinbras is like, I'm going to do this thing. I'm going to get the land back that my father lost. Whereas Hamlet is still like, my father's ghost told me to avenge his death, and he told me that Claudius was the one who killed him, but that could also be an evil spirit trying to trap me and damn me for eternity. I definitely dislike Claudius, and I really dislike the fact that my mother married him so soon after my father's death, but I've got to be absolutely sure that he really is the murderer. So we've got those parallels going. And at this point, I shall be quiet and see you when we go through Act 3, the end.